Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part 3 of an ongoing series focused on caching as it relates to ConfigMgr, understanding the options. Today's topic focuses on BranchCache. Here's the agenda. What is BranchCache? What is this combination between ConfigMgr and BranchCache, and why do we care? What are the requirements for ConfigMgr and BranchCache? Setting up, configuring ConfigMgr and BranchCache, watching ConfigMgr and BranchCache in action. We'll wrap up with a bit of troubleshooting tips and tricks discussion, and we will be done. Okay, so what is BranchCache? Well, BranchCache is a Windows Server feature. So I put this in bold here on purpose, right? Because this is a feature that's been around since Server 2008 R2. It has been traditionally something that you would configure in the server and the client OSs directly through group policy, things like that. The configuration of this feature is much easier now in Configuration Manager for ConfigMgr to leverage it. And so I highlight it as a Windows Server feature because if you get into ConfigMgr and you see how easy it is to configure, it almost can give the impression that this is a ConfigMgr piece. It isn't. It is a Windows Server piece that ConfigMgr can take advantage of. BranchCache, like any other caching solution, is a mechanism to optimize network usage, share downloaded content locally with peers. Any content could qualify. This, again, is a Windows Server feature. It is not limited to ConfigMgr only content, though certainly our discussion today will be focused on ConfigMgr and how ConfigMgr can leverage BranchCache. BranchCache is also subnet based. So if a client's on the same subnet, does not have the content, then it can be retrieved from a BranchCache enabled peer that might already have it. That's also another point you'll see in a minute. This is a Windows feature. The topic of peer caching we talked about relates to boundary groups and things of that nature that will help configure it in ConfigMgr environment. This is a Windows feature. The concept of boundary groups really doesn't play here at all because it's a Windows feature. It's subnet based, right? Okay. Supports all content types. So Windows systems must support BranchCache in order to participate. Windows systems, all of the supported versions of Windows systems do support BranchCache these days, so should not be an issue. BranchCache also will support OSD related content. There's a couple of thoughts around that and some hoops you could talk about with it that we won't get into today. But it does fully work in a Windows PE environment, in a full OS environment, whatever. There are some third-party options out there that can help streamline this in terms of the OSD process, but again, not required. One of them that's available is a solution from a company called 2Pint. It's called the OSD Toolkit. Never used that toolkit, but I've read a bit about it and sounds interesting. So not an endorsement at all of that toolkit. I just don't know, but I know that third party exists as one option at least to help augment perhaps some of the things that you might want to do with BranchCache and OSD. And on the right-hand side, so we're working our way through the ConfigMgr caching options. Again, BranchCache is not a ConfigMgr piece, but ConfigMgr can absolutely leverage BranchCache, and so that's highlighted because we're talking about that today. So what is ConfigMgr and BranchCache? Already mentioned this, right? ConfigMgr makes it really, really easy to enable BranchCache on its own systems and clients. So it appears, it will appear as if BranchCache might even be a ConfigMgr feature. Again, it's not. It's just something that ConfigMgr is engineered to leverage if it's available and to make it easy to turn on. Why do we care about ConfigMgr and BranchCache? Well, again, really easy to enable. It's a built-in capability of supported Windows and Server client systems, Server 2008 R2+, Windows 7 Plus, again, all of those supported operating systems around today will include this, right? All kinds of supported content, again, content even outside of configuration. So what are the requirements for working with ConfigMgr and BranchCache? Well, okay, so just looking at the top one, ConfigMgr current branch. Okay, technically that's not true. yes, the discussion we're having today is centered around ConfigMgr current branch. Using ConfigMgr current branch is the way all environments that are leveraging ConfigMgr today should be focused. It's much easier to enable BranchCache support with Configuration Manager current branch. But BranchCache support has been available in ConfigMgr since 2007 days. You can enable BranchCache with ConfigMgr 2007. You can enable it with ConfigMgr 2012, no problem. It's just that you would need to do a little bit more manual work in those cases. Can be done. There's a blog article I actually wrote on it years ago talking about how to enable BranchCache with those versions of ConfigMgr in the blog case, specifically ConfigMgr 2007. So, in complete accuracy, you don't have to have ConfigMgr current branch, but ConfigMgr 2007 and 2012 are nearing end of life very soon anyway as of this recording, and again, everyone should be on ConfigMgr current branch. That is a ConfigMgr user these days, and so just calling that out, right? So in terms of ConfigMgr clients and servers, you can enable those pretty easily to support BranchCache. In the case of a distribution point, it's just a simple checkbox on the properties of the distribution point. In the case of clients, it's a simple client setting that you can turn on to enable BranchCache. Again, you can do it manually if you want to, but really not necessary. And some of the tediousness of even the blog article I wrote previously that talks about the different configurations and testing and things of that nature, all of that is largely simplified with letting ConfigMgr configure everything. So it's a good idea, right? Okay. Supported operating system. You do need to have a supported operating system running. You should anyway. If you have any supported operating system version out there, you will be covered from BranchCache perspective. So Server 2008 R2 Plus, Windows 7 with SP1 Plus are your base, and then everything previous to that is now unsupported anyway, so it doesn't matter really, right? And then enable your deployments to use BranchCache. So that's something you had to do. It was checked by default. But in 1802 forward of ConfigMgr current branch, that is not even an option on deployments any longer because it is turned on by default. The expectation is if you have BranchCache enabled, you want to use it. And so don't require selecting it on deployments, right? Make it a default enabled thing on deployment. So it is, and you won't see that check mark in 1802 forward. All right, so how do you go about configuring this thing called BranchCache? Let's pull in the lab, and we'll walk through it. Pretty easy, actually. So again, to kind of start, we've talked about in part 1 of this series, and 2, focused on peer caching, that boundary groups are a requirement to be able to use the peer caching feature. That is not true for BranchCache. BranchCache is a Windows feature, so boundary groups is a ConfigMgr thing. So boundary groups not required at all for BranchCache. It is a Windows feature. So how do we go about enabling BranchCache? Again, 2 places we have to go. First is on our distribution point, or points. In my case, I have 1, and it's a simple checkbox. So if I go to Properties on my distribution point, then you'll see enable and configure BranchCache for this distribution point. That's all you have to do. And once you do that, then you can easily go and verify that BranchCache has been turned on in Server Manager. So if I open Server Manager here, now that I've seen that that is turned on, if I wait on my system to pop up, there we go. Server Manager, and look, I'm going to add roles and features. This is a feature. So I'm just going to add roles and features. You'll see that it is actually already there. So click next on this a couple of times. And here we are. BranchCache is installed. I didn't have to configure one thing. ConfigMgr installed and configured this for me on the server side. So then I need to configure on the client. So that's also easy under client settings. I just have my default client settings here where I've turned it on for everyone. So if I go to Properties, and go up under Client Cache Settings, there's the option to configure BranchCache, yes, and then also the option to enable BranchCache, right? So pretty easy to get going. Now that we've enabled BranchCache and enabled the configuration of BranchCache. How do we look on a client to validate, in fact, branch caching has been turned on? So what I'm going to do is pull in one of my test clients first, and we'll just quickly look at it. We'll be back to this. I'll show you a couple of things here, and then we'll be back to it in a minute. So this client, all of my clients, are enabled for BranchCache and configured for BranchCache. How do I validate that? Well, there's a couple of ways. The first place will be in my logs, either the CAS log. I can't remember which one it is. Let's see. Yeah. So BranchCache startup task, you can just see little indicators of BranchCache in here. Enabling BranchCache is in CAS. You'll see different things like that. You'll also, I believe, see an entry in data transfer service. Let's see. No. So I think it must just be the CAS log where we see that. But really, the logs, I show you that just to show you there's some indication in the logs about BranchCache. The logs, when it comes to BranchCache, you will see as we go forward, are largely not helpful, right? Not meaning that the logs aren't helpful. It's just the BranchCache, the indicator of using BranchCache, is really not a logged behavior. There are other ways to see it, as you will see in a little bit. Another way to tell on this system that BranchCache is enabled, just go into your command prompt and netsh status all, right? And you will see details about it. So again, we'll come back to this command. You'll see a few of these commands several times. But running this command will tell you, hey, we're in distributed caching mode. If you read my blog, you'll see that we only support distributed caching mode. Again, you didn't have to configure it. ConfigMgr client gets the instruction to configure it. Serve peers on battery powered disabled. Current status running. Service startup type is manual. And so we're good. We also see 10% of the hard disk space is being used in active cache size and public the cache location and other details about it, right? The another thing we could do just while we're here, and again, we'll do this probably a couple of times as we go through, is to look at the local cache. And that will just show us, again, that section of it. And there's another netsh command we'll use here in a bit. The purpose of this is not to get finely in those details, but just to show you, an example of how you can confirm that BranchCache is enabled, right? So also, just back to default client settings just for a minute, because we enabled caching here, right? This is where that 10% comes from. This is also a BranchCache setting. So you can control how much of the disk space percentage is used for BranchCache as well, right? Okay, so let's get that out of here. Now again, just before we move on, so BranchCache and disk space, a comment about that. BranchCache will, if you turn on BranchCache, it will essentially cause the content to be stored on the clients twice. Does that mean that you will use exactly 2 times the amount of disk space? Not necessarily, right? Because there is some difference. There are some differences in how BranchCache stores the data and so forth. But just be aware of that. There's a separate BranchCache and a separate ConfigMgr client cache. Whenever ConfigMgr retrieves the information out of BranchCache, then it will store it in its client cache. And so again, I should be very specific. For those clients that are enabled for BranchCache, to serve the BranchCache content, to store the BranchCache content, that information will be stored twice, essentially on the machine. For clients that leverage BranchCache to pull the content, then they don't have to be serving the content. They can be just retrieving the content from BranchCache, and then it will just be stored in their client cache. Anyway, just something for awareness there as you consider BranchCache. So that's configuring BranchCache. Now let's see how it works. So starting with this diagram, just a bit of a flow, essentially, of how things work. So here are 3 clients that happen to be on the same subnet. So the idea is the first client here in the group, just say the one on the left, right? Or let's say the one on the right, either way, right? The first client, the one on the right, will request the content. That's step 1. Step 2, the management point will return the content locations over here. Right? Step 3 is this client will go retrieve the content from an available distribution point. Step 4 is this client will now have the content, and it is BranchCache enabled, and so it will store content files that are 64K or greater into the cache. So 64K or 63K and lower, I guess, will not be by default. You can change that, but it's just to acknowledge that smaller files, it may not be necessary to really store those in BranchCache, where larger files, yeah, you get benefit from that. And then finally, so this one's done. Then step 5, the middle client will go request the content. Step 6, the management point returns the content locations as normal. Step 7, that content will still be retrieved from an available distribution point. Now, it may not be all of it, may depend on where we are, but there is a time in which the first two systems in a subnet will need to cache the content, hash, start generating hash values on the content and so forth. So step 8 then, this middle system, the content cached on the BranchCache enabled system is now ready for acquisition by anyone else. And so the third system, the one on the left, will ask for content again. And it will get the management points just like the other two, except this time it does not actually pull from the DP, it pulls from the BranchCache enabled peers, like you would expect. So how does that work in practice? Well, let's walk through the lab, and I'm going to set up a few scenarios. First of all, I'm going to go through and make sure the lab is totally ready for work, and I want to show you this just so that we're all on the same page as we go through. So I'm going to go to my first client system. This is just a Windows 10 system. System 1 for Demo 2 is my naming convention. So Demo 2 meaning this is the second caching scenario of the series. I'm doing the BranchCache anyway. Don't worry about that. But this is my first Windows 10 system for BranchCache. And so what I want to do is make sure that this system does not have any content at all from BranchCache, from ConfigMgr, makes no difference, right? I'm not going to do anything on this system yet except run a few commands. And so I'm going to go to the command prompt, and I'm going to run, make sure BranchCache is enabled. It is, we just did this on this system. So we know BranchCache is enabled, active, and so forth. And by the way, note the active current cache size. We'll see if that changes in a minute, 509.346, and see if that changes in a minute. It may or it may not. I honestly don't recall, but I just want to call that out. So this is running, right? We're good. And so what we need to do is also just note down, because we'll go here in a minute, the actual cache location, right? Now, one thing about this cache location you'll see whenever we go there in a bit is this uses a jet database. It is not, in fact, let's just go there now. Right? This is a system enabled. Let me copy this. Probably make it easier. I'll just go look at it now. If I can get copy and paste to work. There we go. All right, so let's copy that. That way I won't forget to go over there and look at it. So this is just a jet database, but this is where all of your BranchCache detail is stored, right? So here's my, which one was it? So PeerDist, right here, repo. So this is where it's stored, and if you look at this, it's a jet database and should be familiar. Now we can't really open it and look at it, but this is where it's stored, right? So it's not really a flat file format, as maybe you did or did not expect, but it's here, right? So we know that it's running and good to go. So I want to remove all of the data from the BranchCache, so we're starting completely fresh and there's nothing here. So I'm going to flush that data, and it's a pretty simple command, a netsh command, BranchCache and flush. Now, what I'm curious about, and I just want to go back, and I don't know what to expect here, is what is the active cache size? Yeah, okay, that is what I was hoping for, is the active cache size went to 0. So it was 509.346. So we have nothing in the cache now at all. And so anything that we do on this system, which will be our first system to get content, will repopulate the cache and we'll have to download it again. So we'll just leave the command prompt open here. But the other place that I need to make sure we're clean is in terms of the ConfigMgr client cache. I don't want anything here at all. So I'm going to go do it the right way. This is not the way I normally do it, but this is the right way to do it. Go to the cache, configure settings, and delete files. I'm just going to delete everything that's in the cache, and then just to make sure, we're going to go and look in the cache and show again, nothing is here at all in the cache. All right, so looking at the cache, CCM cache is empty. So system number 1 is ready to go. Now let's make sure system number 2 is ready to go. Right, so same deal. I'm just going to work through this one. Again, thought about going ahead and doing this ahead of time so you didn't have to watch me do it, but I think there's some value in actually letting you see me work through this. So just to confirm, BranchCache is working. Here, same deal as before. We're going to see that we do have data in the cache. We're going to clear that with the flush cache command, just like normal, right? And then we will move on to the client. So netsh flush. Oh, what was that? netsh BranchCache flush. Sorry, not show flush. And great, so now we have 0 data in the cache, which is exactly what I want. And then I'm going to clear the ConfigMgr cache as well. All right, and ConfigMgr client. I won't actually go to the cache on this. I will actually trust the system this time. So I'm going to delete files, and yes. Okay, great. So it's, oh, why not? Let's just go look at it, just so we can all see the state of the system as we're approaching this. Okay, fine. So Windows and CCM cache is empty. All right, so we will minimize this and leave that up and running and get rid of this one. And then finally, on the third system, we have to do the same thing. And here's that system that we're pulling in. This is the third. And we will run through it all again. Show status, BranchCache show status. Okay, so we see it's enabled, running. So we're going to flush the cache. Great, so we're flushing it, and then we will show it again. Nothing here. Go to the control panel. Great, ConfigMgr, cache, configure, delete files, yes, yes, okay, and then confirm there is nothing in the cache, and it's empty, right? Okay, so again, this is the third system. So I've worked through all 3 clients in my lab, and we will use these clients to actually do the demo now that they are completely clean. All right, so now that we've done that with all of our client machines, let's actually start through the demo to see BranchCache working. So a couple of things just to note again, and it's on the diagram. So BranchCache functionality is triggered only for content of greater than 64K in size. That is a by default thing. It can be modified. And then secondly, and this is also noted in the diagram, when the first BranchCache enabled system downloads and caches content, the hash generation process begins. When the second BranchCache enabled system downloads content, the process of hash generation completes. Now the content's ready to be fully served from BranchCache. And then when the third system goes and retrieves the content, it will be delivered from BranchCache. And that's what we are going to do here. So let me show you the demo environment, and I'm leaving this at all defaults. So let me pull back in the ConfigMgr system first. And so specifically, I have a deployment here, just a really simple demo package, if you will. And it's just to run a batch file, right? So that batch file is, the source directory is here. The source directory is here. And I put a couple of files in here to exceed the 64 gig size because all of my test files are not
bigger than 64 KB size, and so these are. And so those should definitely trigger through BranchCache. Right? Okay. So we've just finished going through all of the clients and flushing the content. So this is a deployed package, and so we can go back to all of the systems and try to run this again. So let's take the site server out of the mix, and let's put in our first client. Here's another piece of detail as well that I want to set up. So here's our client. Before we do that, let's go into WMI. And I want to make sure WMI doesn't have any record at all of previous downloads. This isn't required for BranchCache to work, but it's just for demo and making sure that we're tracking everything that's going on. So one of the places, and this is kind of a sneak preview, I mentioned the logs aren't really helpful in determining whether content has come from BranchCache or the normal distribution point. This is where you can really get some good detail as to what's going on with a given job. So if I go to root, CCM, content, transfer manager, right? And then a name class is recursive. There's a particular WMI namespace that will track all of the download jobs and will show download history. So what I want to do is make sure this is blank. And it is, and so that's good, right? Cool. And so we'll come back to this later on, and I'll do this on every client as I kind of step through it. Okay, so that's empty. So now let me go to Software Center, and I'm going to execute the package. I think Software Center is right there. There it is. Great. So I've previously deleted the cache, and just to prove it again, here's the cache. It's empty. I'm going to reinstall this batch file, and it's going to go reacquire the content. And off it goes. And so it just ran the content. Now that content is in the cache. So there's a couple of things we're going to do real quick here. First, I want to see if that's in BranchCache and also see if, in fact, this is now showing on the system in WMI. So if I go back to my command prompt and run my show status all, notice the active current cache size is 0. What is it now? Now we've grown the cache again. So we know that there's detail in BranchCache. And now that I know it's here, let's go. I'm going to go ahead and close this out now because we're done with it. Let's go back into WMI and see, in fact, if it's showing as a download job. Hopefully it will. And well, hopefully this will launch. Okay, go. All right, so connect. And then class is recursive again. Okay. And go on down to the same namespace, download history. Look at instances. We have one now. We'll show them off. And notice the download type and the download source right here was from my distribution point. You might not know that's my distribution point, but it is my distribution point. So that came as normal and expected because we didn't have it anywhere else. We had to get it from the DP so that we could put it into BranchCache. So all of that working as normal for now, right? So that is client 1. Now that's in BranchCache and hash generation can begin. Let's go look at the same process, but this time on client 2. Okay, so I'll pull that back up. And again, just to validate that there is nothing in the cache, so we'll go to Software Center, and we will run this again. Right? Oh, and let's also validate, before we do this, in WebMTest, that the entries are gone. I'll go ahead and run. All right, good enough. And then unknown classes, recursive, okay. Scroll on down, content download, or CCM download history, instances. There actually are some instances here, so I'm just going to delete those real quick. I'm not going to make you watch me delete all those. I'm going to make sure they're gone, and I will be right back. Okay, so everything is
gone at this stage, and so the download that we do now will show up in here, hopefully, and we'll see what we see. So we're going to go ahead and run that download, reinstall, and see what happens. So it's running, it's going to download, it's starting to download, and should be done pretty quickly here, should flash up there, and we are done. So let's go take a look. Pulling up BranchCache here again. So we had no content in the cache here in the last run, so we'll run it again. Now we have content showing up in the cache. Now let's see, again, let's confirm it's there. It is. Here's the content, right? And this is the right content, has all the pieces that it should have. Now let's go see what happened with the job history in WMI. So I'll just run that. Connect, same as before. All right, enum classes and recursive, and we should have one job in here, or one download job instances, and we have a couple. That's interesting, right? So the job IDs are the same, but if we look at the first one and look at showmoff, then we see that it came from BranchCache. If we look at the second one and see where it came from, showmoff, it came from the distribution point. Why could that possibly be? Well, again, remember, we flagged the system to only store the 64K and greater files in BranchCache, so those will come from BranchCache. Also, there are a number of files here that are not 64K in size, and so those will need to come from a traditional DP. But also, and a part of this, we'll see on the third system in a minute, but a part of this could be that this is not a fully baked BranchCache scenario yet, that things are still maybe hashing through and being calculated and so forth. So it'll be really interesting to see when we get to the third system what the result is. But in this case, it's the same job ID, and so one part of it came from BranchCache and one part of it came from the traditional distribution point. So let's close all this and go now to our third system. So we definitely are seeing BranchCache work on this system, but let's go to the third one and see what the results are when we look there. So pulling in system number 3. Okay. All right, so we're going to do something different on this system as well, because this is the system now that we fully expect to pull everything from BranchCache. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into my WMI and make sure we're clear in terms of download history, just like I did on the other. Great, all right, and then enum classes, recursive, okay. Look at our download history. I'm sure we probably have some here that we need to get rid of. Download history, instances. No, okay, good. So I don't have to go through and pause the video and get rid of anything. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, so I've kind of already pulled the covers back a little bit, how you can tell if content is coming from BranchCache or if it's coming from a traditional DP. But still, and I've already talked about how the default limit is 64K plus files will be stored in BranchCache, and anything less than that will come from the network still. But still, you might want to be able to know a little bit more in a refined way what the impact is of BranchCache in your environment. So let's show you. So I'm just about to run the job, and since this is my third system and this is my final system, I want to show you how you could track this. So if I work or start up an open performance monitor, I've actually got some data collection sets already defined, but if you want to do this yourself, you would go into user defined and you would create a new data collector set, right? So call it whatever you want to, BranchCache 2, since I already have the original BranchCache, and I'm going to create it manually, okay? Then I'm going to create data logs, and I'm going to create a performance counter data log next. And I'm going to add my performance counters to the log. So there is a set of BranchCache specific performance counter logs. You can pick and choose if you like, but I just like to include everything here.
And so I will highlight this and add everything. So I have all of the logs and hit OK. And then I can specify any sample intervals if I want to. This is every 15 seconds. So whatever you want to do is fine. And so I'm going to click next and finish it, right? Save and close. So finish. All good. So I have my BranchCache 2 collector set, and I have my BranchCache 1 just in case anything happens with 2. And so I'm about to run this. And so what I want to do is just start capturing data. And so now I'm going to pull up my batch test and again confirm my CCM cache is empty, which it is, and reinstall this. So I'm going to wait for it to download. It's going to go do its thing here in just a minute or so. Okay, so it's starting. Good. Well, it's figuring itself out. Now it's done. And you just saw it run. So I can go and stop my data collector set. I don't need to keep it running. So I'm good. Just to confirm, I do have everything in my cache. It came down, right, just as expected. You saw the program run. So now I can go in and look at the report of the data. Right? Before I do that, let's go see what actually happened, and with our WMI first. Right? So let's go back into Web and Test. So the question on the table is not whether this came from BranchCache. We expect that part of it did, at least. But was it all from BranchCache? All right, so let's name classes recursive and go look. Download history, instances. And again, we have 2 instances, which you probably guessed that would be the case. Part of it from BranchCache, and part of it from our distribution point. Okay, right there. So we are leveraging BranchCache for sure. But again, we're leveraging some from the distribution point because of our default settings of only putting stuff in BranchCache that's 64K or higher, and we have the key files are all 1 or 2K in size, so you get that, right? So now that we know that, we can still see kind of the balance between what's coming from BranchCache and what's coming from the network, right? So we can just run our user-defined report, come in here, and view this. Open this up. Just view it. Now this is a graph, and this is great if you want to kind of dissect this. This is not, in my opinion, the best view. The best view is to look at a report. And so this will show you the details about bytes from cache, bytes from server, and retrieval averages, and different things of that nature, right? So that's a really good place to go and look and see the detail and so forth. So that is BranchCache kind of end to end. Oh, and before I leave this, yeah, we did talk about it end to end, but before I leave that, I want to show you. So you see that there's content coming from the traditional DP and from BranchCache. I mentioned before that in the client logs, it doesn't really tell you anything useful about what's coming from BranchCache and so forth. Just want to show you. The traditional logs that you would use are the CAS, and so we can start there and look. We'll see BranchCache enable. Actually, let me go down to the bottom and search up. So here we see, yeah, it's getting added to the cache and so forth, and it's coming from only this one distribution point that is found. That's the only location it's found. So if I scan through this, it looks just like traditional content. So if I move down a little bit, there's the data transfer service, right? And move to the bottom, and I can see again that it's only showing the traditional distribution point that I would pull from. There's no reference at all to any client machine which would host my BranchCache, right? And then the actual content transfer manager is also going to reference this, right? Okay.
And one thing actually that I have an idea about that I want to test real quick. Let me walk you live through the testing with me. So I want to turn on verbose and debug logging, and I don't think it's on here, and this is why I have a question as I'm going through this. All right, so CCM logs at global, log level is normal, so let's put that to 0. And then I'm going to also add a folder here. All right, so let's actually go do this again. I'm kind of going to fudge things a little bit here. Just because I have a thought and I want to see if it merits out, and it's kind of fun to test it anyway. So let's get rid of stuff in the cache. Delete the files. Yes. Okay, and so let's pull up Software Center again. This is my third client, so it's one that we should be good to go with regardless. So let's go reinstall. And it's 9:56 on the system. So let's go reinstall this thing. Waiting to install, downloading. And this time, by turning on verbose and debug in the log, I get more detail about what exactly this component is doing. So you saw it without verbose and debug, and now I'm trying it with. So let's actually go look in the data transfer service log again with verbose and debug turned on. So if I scroll down, notice it's transferring files, okay? Transferring files 1 through 12. Okay, so 12 total files. And the thought that I had, and let's see if it proves out at all, let's go back to our source directory. So if I go into my source directory and look at this and how many files we have, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 files. Okay, so that didn't merit out. What I was wondering is if we were only going to download these files because they're smaller and not reference the others. These are the ones that I would expect to come from BranchCache. That doesn't seem like the log is meriting that out. I thought that might be a backdoor way into kind of referring to what files were coming from the traditional distribution point versus peer or BranchCache. Didn't seem to work out. That was a fun experiment, so I'll just move on from here. But just thought I would check that out and see. Okay, so that's end-to-end BranchCache. So let's kind of start to wrap up in just a few tips and tricks as we get going, right? So BranchCache does use bits for download. That's a question that came up in one of the discussions I had whenever I did this session live with a customer. And so the question, does BranchCache use bits? Absolutely. BranchCache uses bits for download. But it can use bits a little bit differently, right? So whenever you have BranchCache, and this is tip 2, when you have BranchCache along with bits, there's a bit of intelligent detection about bursts that can happen on the network. If a number of clients are coming to all get the content at once, we can detect and help mitigate, some bursts. You can actually do some configuration too. So this was another part of the question that kind of led into the whole bits thing that I was referring to with a customer. Let me pull back in this test client. Doesn't really matter which one, but a test client here. So let me show you. So if we go to the registry, you do have options where you can manage some of the experience about bits on your machine, right? So let's collapse everything. Great. So we're going to go into local machine and then software and then Microsoft. And then under Microsoft, we're going to go to Windows. So I'll collapse this. And Windows. Great. And then current version. Okay. And then finally, bits. And there are a number of things you can actually set here that the ConfigMgr client can actually set for you as well, part of this, but you can go set certain entries that might help you as you're going through. And so, for example, maximum background
cache retries, and maximum foreground cache retries, and then cache retry interval in minutes. So some of these are out there to help you be able to configure more specifically bits if you need to. And then finally, tip number 3, so how do you track branch cache and bits together? So if we go into the event viewer and go into the applications and services logs, I'll actually go ahead and close this out. Applications and services logs, and when that opens up, we will go down under Microsoft and then Windows. There we go, Microsoft and Windows. Then there's 3 places that we can kind of stop here. Let me make this bigger. So the first is in terms of the bits client. So we have some detail here to help us understand analytics stuff and then operational stuff, different detail of information that's coming from bits and so on. You can see different just things about starting and stopping jobs and so on. Then there's also, if we roll on down, there's branch cache and there's the operational, and you can just see different entries and maybe not a whole huge amount detected there, but some. Then there's a branch cache SMB that might be helpful in certain cases and so on. Again, not to dig too deeply into any one of those, but just to kind of walk through. And so that walks through really end to end what I wanted to show you about using branch cache and configuration manager and kind of how it all works. And really easy to set up. I showed you some behind the scenes nitty gritty stuff that in a production environment you, unless you're troubleshooting, really don't need to mess with. But hopefully interesting. So we'll wrap this session here and we will see you next time.